We now welcome Human rights are governed by the following principles: universality, inalienability, indivisibility, interdependence and interrelatedness, equality and non-discrimination, participation and inclusion, and the accountability and rule of law. Although our rule of law is a little bit different than your rule of law. Because we have to answer to the natural elements, all those relations, the fish, the waters, the animals, the four-legged, the plants, the medicines. Those are part of our rule of law as Indigenous peoples. You know, for hundreds of years, we have been struggling to survive. And to this day, we are still struggling to survive. We are still pushing back against the colonial assimilation policies that continue to govern and control our lives. We are still considered wards of the state because we have a trust fund. We have a trust fund that was created in 1886, which the Auditor General, former Auditor General Sheila Fraser talked about, and is controlled by Indigenous, or I'll say Indian, and Northern Affairs, because under the rules of Canada, I'm still an Indian. You still like to call us First Nations as a polite political way of saying we respect who you are, but under Canada's laws, I'm an Indian under the Indian Act. And so our languages and our cultures, our customs, and our traditional forms of governments have been attacked. And so one of the things that I've learned along the way in my road of healing is how trauma affects people. So my grandmother on my father's side went to Indian residential school in Shinwak Indian Residential School. So Dr. Maria Braveheart Yellowhorse, who is an Oglala Sioux at the University of New Mexico, started to coin a phrase called multi-generational trauma. So even now, today, scientists are talking about the trauma that experienced in the womb is passed on to that child. And then we learn about those behaviors, right? In Indian residential school, children were not taught how to love. They didn't have that parenting role models. And then they were sent home and they were told by the church, you get married and you have kids. And so a lot of the social problems that you see are colonial rooted. And I really have to stress to all of you who are social, you know, you're working in the public sector, please don't say, oh, I know so-and-so came here last week from your community. They must be your brother or your cousin or your sister. Don't say that, because we want to have our privacy too. You may think we live as a collective like 200 years ago, but we are very much individualistic in 2018, and we value our privacy. And one of the things about historical unresolved grief that accompanies trauma is the following characteristics of don't tell, don't trust, don't feel. So we zip it all in. And as we know, stress is a contributing factor to our health and well-being. And so if we are told that our languages are inferior, it's okay, you can have a couple of $1,000s to practice your powwows once a year. And yes, your children can learn your language as a third language in your schools, and that the Quebec curriculum or the provincial curriculum is the one that should be taught in the schools, or your schools will not receive funding. That sends a very strong message that still in 2018, we are not valued for who we are as human beings, because that's what we are, we're human beings. I know there's a big Aboriginal industry that now is all about reconciliation. All of a sudden, universities are getting involved in interests about Indigenous languages. And we're going to record Indigenous languages, but I can tell you, a language is alive. A language is part of who you are as your identity. Just like Quebecers wanted to protect the French language. You have laws, you have everything. There is nothing in here that says this is Haudenosaunee territory. There is nothing that says this is the ancestral place of my ancestors. Nothing. In fact, you praise and you make statues of the people who you called Indian killers and who very much are on the right-wing side, just like Donald Trump, of trying to exterminate Indigenous peoples. So you as public servants need to do better than your government. You need to do better than the education system that your children and grandchildren will be living in and that you have experienced, because I've experienced the same kind of education. Because the myths about us sway how we receive our services. So let's look at the Mohawks, the Mi'kmaq, the Naskapi, the Cree, and the Inuit. Anglophone communities in a French province. So when we go to get services, if we don't speak in French, we are treated differently. That's discrimination. In the rest of Canada, if you see a brown-skinned person from a First Nations community, you will also treat them differently. Not always, but this is what happens. And we are human beings just like you. We bleed when we get cut. Our bones break if we do something stupid or get in an accident, right? We want fresh water just as much as anybody. We want to be able to take a shower, wash our dishes, and make sure that our families are using clean water. But because for so long the government has neglected and has been neglectful on the needs, the human needs, the fundamental human rights of a human being, that we are looking at lagging behind in such a huge undertaking of trying to give Indigenous people the same quality of life that Indigenous peoples, that the rest of Canada has. And Sheila Fraser also said it would take 28 years for the communities to have the same quality of education that is found in the rest of Canada. You can call me dated, but that stuck out in my mind. Because one of the things that people think is that we get a free education. That everything we get is free. Oh, you guys don't pay taxes. Yeah, in the community. We come to Montreal, we're going to pay taxes. We work in Montreal, Ottawa, wherever, we're going to pay taxes. And we don't do it, some people will do it grudgingly, but that's the way of life. But going back to that 1886 trust fund, that is where the money comes from for our communities, for us to receive services. That trust fund, which was coming from the minerals and resources taken from our traditional territories, which the Royal Proclamation had said we would be unmolested by the settlers coming in, which wasn't true. So we keep getting squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. And the government keeps telling you, we are spending X billion amount of money on Indigenous peoples. Well, I can tell you that about 64 to 67% of that goes to the administration and the bureaucracy in the government of Canada and its provinces and territories. And we're left to fight over the rest. Those are the realities I want you to know about. Because we want to help you give us a good service. We want you to be able to help us, to help our families. When they go to the hospitals, when they ask for some service that every single person in this country is entitled to, we are not asking for more. We are asking for equity. We are asking for equality. We don't feel that we are privileged. A lot of people look at us and say the benefits of being an Indian under the Indian Act. If that was so, we should be the richest people in this country, no? Right? Right. But we're not. We still have to struggle. And since the government is kind of like, unsure of how to deal with this problem, and in Quebec they call it question autochtone, right? The Aboriginal question. What is the question, by the way? What is the problem? Is it the same problem that Duncan Campbell Scott and Sir John A. Macdonald saw in us? Are we still that kind of a problem to be dealt with and to be hidden away from the rest of society? Because that's what it does feel like. We're in 2018. We're supposed to be in a supposed age of enlightenment. When are we going to be enlightened? Because as Canada grows and takes our resources, increases pipelines, contaminates our water, and we look at, the UN has talked about the use of water. I attended a UN meeting once, and at least 74% of the world's water is used by farmers. I love farmers because that's who feeds us. And those farmers are using pesticides. And just like everything else, it leaches into the ground. The earth is like a sponge, It's like when we die, she's ready to take us. She gently takes us in. Well, she gently takes in everything. So if you have something that is a contaminant it's going to reap into the water supply. In my community, we have aquifers, and we are using, the majority of us have well water. And so when we look at the enormous amount of development that's going on in my small community, from a proposed niobium mine to more pipelines, it's exhausting. We're a small community. We don't have the resources to be able to compete and to deal with the legalities of creating these development. We have to go to the National Energy Board. And then we have the government who's saying, we're going to decolonize and you're going to have self-government, not self-determination. There's a big difference, by the way, of self-determination and self-government. In self-determination, we are those nations that your ancestors met. We need to build up those institutions that have been attacked by colonization. And when we rebuild those institutions, you will benefit too. Your culture, your society will be enriched, but you gotta help us. You gotta help us get there. Don't take the lead. Walk beside us. Your government is kind of listening. I dread the fact if another Harper gets in, because he was ready to just get rid of everything, from environmental assessments to getting rid of any support for what little support we have for indigenous languages. And I was telling Drew that I was reading up on you guys. And I was really impressed by the energy, the green energy that you guys all want. We want that too. We desperately want that, but it costs, huh? Everybody wants to be green, but if you want to have a hybrid car, if you want to have solar panels, if you want to have all those wonderful things that can bring more sustainable living for everybody, it costs money, right? Fossil fuels, if we just keep going along, sure, there's a lot of jobs, but they're going to end somewhere. And then for Indigenous people, we are always thinking about the future. We're thinking about today. As an elder said, men think about different things. They think about today, whereas women think about today, but also tomorrow. What is life going to be like tomorrow? So I want you, especially you guys in the room, I want you to reach into your feminine side and think about that future. It's good to have jobs for today. And we need to have our people trained so we can be self-determining. But we also need your help to get there. I was talking about the don't tell, don't feel, don't trust. When we go outside of the little quartiers of our communities, we feel like aliens on our homeland. We don't see any part of us that's there. And so imagine the youth. We have high suicide rates in our communities. Why is that? Why isn't there people more outraged? And yes, it happens to everybody, but we are smaller in numbers. It was estimated that after the first century of contact with Europeans, 3/4 of the indigenous populations in the Americas were wiped out by war and disease. Intentional genocide. How is Canada going to move forward, especially with the neighbor to the south that you're having trouble with right now? How is Canada going to be a leader in bringing about the kind of quality of life that it professes to the international community that it has? Because when we look at the quality of life index, including Indigenous peoples' communities, you drop to what, 67? Why is that? Why is there such, I mean this respectfully, why is there such ignorance when it comes to the realities and situations of Indigenous people and what has caused us to be where we are? I come from a community that is very divided, but so are you guys. We're just like you. Not everybody thinks the same, but we're human beings. And I want to stress that again. We're human beings. We are flawed. Yes, we are not perfect. Yes, we are not united in certain things. But we want to have a good communities for the children to grow up in. And I want to hear our languages spoken before I go. And How many of you here have read the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? Oh, that's not many, not many. That was passed in 2007. And your government said that it would implement it. It's not just a matter of endorsing it. And declarations like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights passed after World War II so that the scourge of inhumanity would not peek its ugly head up again. They created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Why did we need an Indigenous declaration? Because colonization has done such damage to us. And colonization continues today. It's not neo-colonialism or anything like that. It's the same colonialism with a different spin. And I want to say this is Haudenosaunee territory. Always has been, always will be. And I am so happy that people continue to come to our territory to have their meetings. I am grateful for the acknowledgement of Haudenosaunee territory. The longhouses that were here, the cornfields of corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, we call them Junhekwa, which means sustainers of life. Together they make a complete protein. Well, together we can make a complete society. It's not impossible. You just have to be open to it. So I want to thank you for inviting me tonight, and I wish you good luck and all the best and of success in the work that you do. Nyawa ji taskada humsadat tanu nyawa sngoya tisu ji dakshnyanu ji tasko gawana su Tony Gawanage. Thank you.